Well, greetings, you curiouser and curiouser Herle Burlyites. It's a hell of a day here on the Herle Burly, our 5th anniversary. We started this podcast 5 years ago not knowing where it would take us. We tried some things, some ideas stuck, some failed. We tried more things. Here's the thing that stuck, our theme music by my friend Ray Martini. Thank you, Ray. I thought it was wonderful the day I heard it, and I still think it's wonderful today. What a gesture. If we found our groove on this show, it's because of your listenership and your feedback on the socials, which does two things for me. Makes me feel generally pretty good when I obsessively check Twitter at 3:15 a.m. and helps shape the future direction of this podcast. So I thank you all for it. Let's get to today. David Axelrod was generous enough to help us launch this thing in 2017, and I'm just so chuffed to welcome him back today. David, as most of you know, is the host of the Axe Files and is one of the people who make Hacks on Tap the must-listen that it is. He's the founder and director of the University of Chicago Institute on Politics. He's a senior political commentator on CNN, and of course, he was the chief strategist for Barack Obama's presidential campaigns. So, just a bit of success. Here's where we're going today. We'll discuss the state of democracy in the U.S. and the electoral implications of the January 6th hearings. What are the midterm prospects, post-Dobbs, post-IRA passage? Will women and young people turn out? Who wins the Democratic primary in 2024? Replica or remedy for Biden? And who wins the GOP primary? And then just some key observations as a political practitioner in an era of media fragmentation and partisan divides. David, thanks a lot for not being turned off 5 years ago when I was doing my first show, didn't know what the hell I was doing. And Thanks for coming back.
Well, I wanted to see how much you've learned, first of all. But, I do remember that 5 years ago, your hair was jet black.
Yes.
You were just a babe in the woods trying to find its way. And here you are now, gray, wizened, yes. But
Totally over the hill.
But it's always good to be with you, David. It's great to be back. And
Thanks.
Congratulations, because I have I just celebrated the 500th episode of my Axe Files podcast, and I know how much work goes into these things, and so good for you. Nice work.
It's the whole air quotes media team that you've just met. It's a big project, putting this thing on. And
I'll tell you what, they're the most impressive 60 people I've ever met. It's unbelievable, the group you have assembled there. It's like NASA.
Yeah, with like NASA, we can't get it off the ground. Hey, Sarah Palin lost last night. You feeling good?
Well, yes. I mean, I think that Sarah Palin is a historic figure in the sense that she was a forerunner to everything that we've seen since. I remember very well 2008, the fall of 2008, and how radically she changed the nature of that election. It didn't help John McCain, but she was much like Donald Trump. She emboldened a lot of people to come out, who were very, very, who were very alienated from the political system, who were alienated by the pace of change, demographic change, a cultural change, she was dog whistling from start to finish, and she really showed the way for Trump in many ways. And so, it was interesting to see her go down. There were obviously extenuating circumstances because they just started this ranked choice voting system in Alaska. Two Republicans in this field went at each other. They're all in the same pot. And they had a very strong Democratic candidate who squeaked by as a result of that because neither of the Republicans thought much of the other Republican by the end of the campaign. And a lot of them left their ballots blank or voted for the Democrat on the second choice. But that notwithstanding, it's significant. We'll see what happens in the fall because they're rerunning the whole thing in the fall. That was a special election to finish 4 months of a guy's term who had been there for 50 years and who is a Republican. And they're going to rerun this whole thing again in the fall to see who serves for the next 2 years.
Amazing how such a, frankly, unremarkable person could have such a big impact.
But you say that, David, but I think it's interesting. I think this is the challenge for Democrats here in this country because that is exactly the comment that the people who voted for Sarah Palin would expect. They feel that the Democratic Party is looking down its nose at them, that it's become a college-educated, cosmopolitan party and doesn't have much appreciation for small-town and rural areas, for people who work with their hands and their backs and don't have.
At the elite level, that's almost certainly true, right?
Yes, I think it's a real danger for the Democratic Party. And, I'll give you an example. I probably, like you and many people, believe that this climate issue is an existential issue for the country, for the world, and we have to do something about it. But I also recognize that if you're someone who for several, is like a third generation miner or oil worker, or, and you make a good middle class living doing it, being lectured on your responsibility to the planet isn't as impactful, when you're trying to figure out how you're going to put food on the table. And there ought to be an appreciation for that, I'm also struck by the fact now you put a quarter in, you're going to get like the 10 plays. But I also,
I selected B1.
Yeah. And here comes 6 other. But I was really struck during the pandemic by the, I think, appropriate uplifting of what we call essential workers. People who, safety workers, health workers, people who worked in stores, people who did things that help us live every day, the lives that we live, and get very little credit and very little money to do it. In New York, people would bang their pots at 7:00 at night. They come out on their gilded balconies and bang their pots. But now that the crisis has passed, they fade back into the woodwork, the essential workers. We're not lionizing them anymore. And, so I just think,
in Ontario here, we've restricted their pay to a 1% increase. After banging those pots and pans for 2 years, we capped their salaries.
Yeah. I mean, it's, I have a child with developmental disabilities, and she lives in a great place, not far from here. But they're reliant on really loving, wonderful direct care workers. And there's a shortage of them now. They're not getting paid as much as they should. And this is happening all over the country. I mean, so, I think the Democrat, I mean, I've been a Democrat all my life, and I share the basic tenets of the Democratic philosophy, but I do think this is an issue that Democrats have to work on, because the way our system works, the Electoral College in the U.S. is such that you can't just write off. Donald Trump won 80% of the counties in this country in 2020. He lost the election just narrowly in a few states. I mean, he lost the overall vote by 7 million, but that's a bunch of people aggregated in the L.A. area and the New York area and metropolitan areas. But there are there's a big sea of red here. And, Democrats need to figure out how to talk to those people again, at least to cut the margins a little. So when you say that about Palin, what the essence of her appeal was that she was a tribune for the people who felt forgotten, who felt ridiculed, who felt neglected, who felt like they weren't part of the vision of the new America that was emerging. And I think it behooves Democrats to be sensitive to that.
No question. I had the person that ran a conservative campaign in Ontario on this podcast, and he said to me, David, there's a lot of people who shower at the end of the day, and you liberals don't know those people anymore at all.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And, I try and always keep that in my mind, because, we, on the one hand, we don't think of them. On the other hand, everywhere you look, they are doing things that are essential to our lives. And, and they work hard and should be respected for the hard work that they do and the value of it. And so, I would love to see, and you see people like Tim Ryan, who's running for the Senate in Ohio right now, very tough state. He's running against J.D. Vance, who's transformed himself into a kind of Trump automaton. But
liberals are burning books. Liberals are burning the hillbilly elegy books they bought.
Yeah. We haven't gotten to that yet. We can't at once decry book burnings and burn them ourselves. But I sat down with him on my podcast on the Axe Files in 2017, and I went back and looked at that transcript. I could barely recognize him.
Right.
But Tim Ryan's whole message is about this, about the dignity of work, and valuing people who work or want to and try hard and are out there trying to make a living for their families and so on. That's fundamental. That used to be fundamental stuff for the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party needs to reacquaint itself with that message.
Where does the break on student loans fit into that theory?
It's a really interesting question. Look, what Biden did in forgiving $10,000 of student loans, $20,000 for students who were on these Pell grants who were low income students, is going to help 40 million people or something. It's not inconsequential, but there's no doubt that there are a whole bunch of people who didn't go to college, who aren't getting help with the loans for their businesses or their homes, or there are people who did go to college and worked their asses off to pay their loans off. And for those people, it's a very mixed thing. And I think that, honestly, it took a long time for Biden to make that decision. I think he has an intuitive sense of that, which is why it took such a long time. I think he was persuaded that he may have been persuaded on the merits, but in the political arithmetic, he was persuaded that this would somehow motivate particularly younger people to come out and vote. I personally think they were motivated already by the Supreme Court decision on abortion in June. There's all kinds of evidence of that, but I do think that's an issue that creates a cleavage. And you saw, like, Tim Ryan was one of the Democrats who said, I don't think this is the right way to go.
Right. Yeah, I think you can make a strong argument that post-secondary should be more accessible in the United States. Yes. But it's hard for me to make an argument that a person that makes $125,000 with $10,000 in student loans and has a university degree is in more need of assistance from the government than somebody that just has grade 12.
Right. No, and a lot of the people who just have grade 12 aren't asking for all that much. I mean, they're out there busting their asses. They'd like to get pay a fair wage. They'd like to be able to save, but this, I'm sure, is irritating to some of them. So, the vast majority of that forgiveness will go to lower income people, particularly because of the Pell Grant element in it. But I think it's a very, very complex thing, and I don't know how it's all going to shake out. They obviously believe the calculus is good, and they're under tremendous pressure from progressives to do it. This has been a front and center issue. And David, I will tell you that in focus groups, you do hear a lot about student loans and what a burden they are. Heidi Heitkamp, who's a friend of mine who used to be the senator from North Dakota, suggested they could have, for example, greatly reduced interest rates on these loans, which I think may have sat better with people, Right. But in any case, it's done.
Right. As promised, we're back in South Korea this week. David Herle here, your tour guide. Please keep your arms and hands inside the imaginary vehicle. Headsets are available, but you're probably already wearing earbuds, so never mind. A reminder that this tour is being brought to you by our presenting sponsor, TELUS. And South Korea is just our first stop of a number of international best practices. Countries who are making evidence-based policy decisions around how they manage their spectrum. a direct precursor to why their innovation economies are thriving the way they are. But how and why did they get there? In the case of South Korea, the root of it is this: key government involvement at the earliest stages and strategic clarity that 5G was going to play a pivotal role in the fourth industrial revolution. The government's transparent, proactive, and long-term focused spectrum planning is what made their early 5G adoption rate possible. Remember what I told you last week: 5G coverage of 98% of the population, according to PwC. South Korea recognized in the early 2010s that making additional spectrum available quickly and efficiently was a crucial lever to accelerate 5G. It laid out its vision for how to do that in a national spectrum roadmap in 2012, and furthered that vision with a comprehensive spectrum plan published in 2017. This comprehensive plan for connecting the country meant South Korea prioritized getting spectrum to use fast. Major policy goals were transparently defined for everyone to see: global business expansion, increased exports, new jobs, and the creation of a safe user environment. And what happens when you take a hard look at the evidence to accelerate 5G adoption? You become a world leader in the innovation economy. TELUS believes there's no reason why Canada can't do the same. And if we can get it right, that's going to have a massive impact on how we live, access better health care, fight climate change, and economically prosper. Herle Burlyites, stay with me next week as we dive deeper into rural and remote spectrum deployment and see how our policies stack up with a number of our G7 cousins. So I want to get into some tactical, strategic machinations, but I want to ask you a big question first, because it's really the thing that's on my mind. It's been 5 long years politically since we spoke.
Yes.
5 very long years.
Yes, dog years.
Democracy's under threat in the United States in a way we couldn't have imagined when we had that conversation. And it isn't only Trump. I mean, you got all those people who believe he won the election. You got major media organizations that pay no attention to the truth whatsoever. Massive disinformation online that people seem unable to discern from the truth. David Pepper was on my show to tell me what the far right is doing at state houses across the United States, and an anger in the population that seems ready to boil over at any time. Are we headed for something really bad?
Well, potentially. I mean, I think a lot of that has to do with how the next few years
you do, eh? You think it's not tectonic plates, it's at the top level?
Well, I wrote a book called Believer, so I have to stick with my brand and hope that that what's happened in the past will happen again, which is that that there's a self-correcting nature to democracy, and that will, and leaders emerge who lead us away from the abyss. Look, we live in a dynamic. I mean, first of all, let me say, I'm not minimizing the threat. We did a poll for the Institute of Politics in the spring, and it was to look at disinformation and media habits, but we threw some questions in there just to be provocative and see how people shook out. And one of them was, I believe the government is corrupt and rigged against people like me. 56% of Americans agreed with that. On the question of, I generally believe elections are fair and counts are accurate. Like 80% of Democrats agreed, most of the independents, and 30% of Republicans agreed with that. Well, that's sort of a bedrock thing in a democracy. If people don't believe that elections are fair, the most alarming to me was that 28% said they thought that it may be necessary soon for citizens to take up arms against the government.
28%.
28%. And, we have a lot of arms down here, David. I don't know if you've read about that, but, we have more guns than people. We have 46%, I think, of the privately held arms in the, firearms in the world are here in the U.S., which may explain why we also have exponentially more homicides here, gun homicides, than anywhere else. But
it's pretty obvious to anybody who doesn't live there, David.
No, I know. And it's pretty obvious to many of us who do. I mean, I live here in the city of Chicago, and within, a mile of here from where I'm sitting right now on the south side of Chicago, kids are living in war zones. And it's heartbreaking. So that was a very alarming number to me. And, you have Trump having taken the baton from Palin, who has taken it to a whole nother level. His whole project is predicated on selling the idea that the system is rigged against people like you, and to make himself the antidote to this corrupt system. And, Donald Trump's whole life, his political project, everything has been predicated on the idea that the world is kind of the Hunger Games, and the strong take what they want and the weak fade away, and that rules and laws and norms and institutions are for suckers. And if you give up on those, that is a death knell for democracy. But put that together with a stat I gave you, 56% of people saying that the government is corrupt and rigged against them. That is why he has an audience. And that is why when he flouts the rules, people kind of say, that's okay, he's fighting the same people we're fighting, so screw them. It's really, and I think you have, so this goes to our original discussion.
But if you believe that, you'd be willing to overthrow the whole system, right? You wouldn't give a shit. Right?
Yes. You're talking about him or his voters? You're talking about
voters. His voters.
Well, I think you have to.
Those stats that you said, 56% say there's government's corrupt and rigged against them.
The question is, how do we get more deeply into why people think the government is corrupt and rigged against them? And how do we communicate with those people? Part of it is made complicated by the thing you said, which is if people only get their information from media outlets, so-called media outlets and sources that are essentially propaganda outfits that are spewing this kind of stuff, that is a big problem that we have to thwart. But I think we do have to pay attention. It is a mistake to say that this is just about Donald Trump. It's not just about Donald Trump. And I think it's also a mistake to say we're just going to write everyone off who voted for him, and we're going to say there's no legitimacy to any of their concerns. And because then you do get into a situation where you're kind of like moving closer and closer to something that just boils over and you can't control.
Okay, but let's get to what their concerns are. And you and I touched on this 5 years ago, but we've had 5 years of experience of watching it. And I'm really struggle with two different diagnoses. If this is about economic unfairness and economic alienation, then this is A, both the fault of progressives, and B, tailor-made for progressives to solve this issue by making the system more fair and by generating better economic results for working people. If the fight is about whether or not the United States is a white, heterosexual, male-dominated Christian country, then what the hell do progressives have to say about that?
Well, you're right. I because that is not something. We live in a diverse, pluralistic society, and I think one of the things that propels this is, in fact, a reaction to change, a reaction to demographic change, a reaction to cultural change, I don't know too many Democrats who are willing to embrace the idea that we can somehow turn the clock back, or should, to 1950. That's not the way. That's not going to happen, and it's not what should happen. But that's different than the discussion we had at the beginning, which is not just about economics. It's about culture. It's about attitudes. It's about respect. And so, I think having leaders, and honestly, Joe Biden got elected because he had a bunch of this, and he did well enough with some of these white working class voters that he was able to beat Donald Trump. But there has to be a connection with people who do take showers at the end of the day. There has to be a connection with people who, and it's not just about making things more economically just for them. Most of them, yes, they want that, but that's not sort of the driving thing. It's also about respect and just not sort of turning, our noses up at them and saying, you just don't get it. Small towns in rural areas have struggled. They've declined. And their sense is that if they just fell off the map, that'd be fine with the majority as it happens. And I think that has to be addressed. So it's attitudinal as much as anything else. I mean, there are people who are never, David, ever going to. There are people who have gone into this dark hole, and they're never going to come out of it. Who are just deeply resentful of change, and but there are a lot of people who I think are I live in a rural area, and a bunch of the time, and my neighbors are good people. I don't talk a lot of politics with them, although some of them volunteered at the time that they had voted for Barack Obama, and there's data to suggest that they probably had, so they voted for a black guy named Barack Obama. But they do have this sense that Trump was speaking to them and speaking for them in a way that most Democrats were not at this point. And that's I just don't think you can write my neighbors off or all of them.
No, but they have a different conception of the country than Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez does, right? They have a different understanding of what the country's very nature is. And so, it's a common, because many of these debates are happening in Canada too, although at a more muted level generally. But, it's a common thing to say, hey, on the left side of the spectrum, you got to dial down the identity politics and dial up the economic politics, which is an easy thing to say if you're a 60-year-old white guy who's not an equity-seeking person.
Yes. No, and striking that balance is a challenging thing to do, but I do think that, and I have a lot of respect for AOC. I think she's a very, very, she's a smart and earnest person, but she should spend more time in those areas, and spend more time kind of listening to people's concerns there, and try and figure out where the nexus is between them. So, it's complicated. It's complicated. I have no doubt. But if either we give up on, because of the nature of our system is because of our constitutional structure, we're going to be at each other's throats forever if we don't figure out a better path, how to talk to each other. And by the way, my main complaint, there is a little bit of more of kind of lecturing and moralizing on the part of the left that bothers me. But my main complaint is the other thing about democracy is that it necessitates consensus and compromise. AOC, sometime in the last year, she tweeted about the Affordable Care Act that, I had an Affordable Care Act healthcare policy, and it had like the deductibles when I was a waitress, and the deductibles were so high I couldn't use it. And that's why I'm for single payer healthcare. Well, you know what? I'm for single payer healthcare too. And what I said back to her was, if you can pass single payer healthcare, by all means do it. But until we do, let's do the best that we possibly can. Right. And that's what I think we have to, it's very rare that you solve these problems in a one fell swoop. I mean, we just passed a historic investment in climate, but it's not a panacea. It's not everything. We tried to do a cap and trade thing back in 2009. We couldn't get it done. So get done what you can get done and keep moving toward the goal. And I really think it's important to embrace that. And, we have a lot of young people who've come into government who are activists, and activists are a really important part of the political process. But once you're in there, you also have to be...
It's different than being in politics.
It is. Sure. It is. It's not just about raising issues and raising hell. It's also about getting results. Right. And, now I was she very much embraced the compromise that Manchin and Schumer wrote that led to the big investment in climate, and good for her. But I think we need more sort of people talking to each other about, well, what can we get done? Instead of trying to weaponize the fact that we can't get anything done.
Right.
Okay, let me just say one more thing, and I'm not just trying to, I know you have a bunch of questions, and I'm not trying to get you to keep
No, you're interesting.
Keep you from asking them. No. But the other thing is when people say the government is corrupt and rigged against them, they're not wrong in the sense that, there is such a powerful group of special interests in this country who have an enormous amount of influence over, yes, money, enormous amount of influence over how we govern, and who stand in the way. A lot of the things, the common sense things that why don't we have gun safety laws?
But those aren't the villains those people would identify.
No, but those are, but nonetheless, it is a corrupting element in our system. And totally. And both parties are complicit in that. Both parties rely on it may be in some cases different players in the system, but in many cases it's the same corrupting element giving money to both sides. And so I think in that sense, taking a very hard stance on that, and progressives have been good on this, and I commend them for it, for really confronting the level of sort of legal corruption that we have in our democracy. I think that creates a lot of jaundice on the part of people.
Yeah, and should. It is the cancer at the heart of your system, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So here's a number: 27 million tons. In the months ahead, CN expects to move up to 27 million tons of grain from the prairies to markets in Canada and the US, and to seaports for shipment abroad. It's a big, crucial job. You simply cannot overstate the importance of grain to the Canadian economy, and getting the crop to market smoothly and safely requires a supply chain in which all the moving parts work efficiently and in harmony. Actually, all signs are that the coming season will be a welcome return to normal. Grain producers are expecting an average crop this year, which is an excellent prospect after last year's devastating drought. Actually, last year was an experience no one wants to repeat. A summer of extreme heat and forest fires was followed by an autumn of heavy flooding, and one of the harshest winters in memory. And of course, COVID disrupted workforces across the country. It was as though the forces of nature were conspiring. In any case, the new season is on us, and CN is prepared. The railway has been hiring and training a new generation of railroaders. And in the past few weeks, I've talked here about the billions of dollars it's invested in locomotives, new rail cars, and improvements to its thousands of miles of tracks, tunnels, crossings, and bridges. The railway reckons it'll be able to move up to 744,000 tons of grain a week this year. And the 27 million tons figure is just a forecast. If the crop is bigger than expected and the grain needs moving, CN will move it. Clearly, the world economy is recovering. Demand for commodities is strong. CN has seen that reflected in its traffic volumes. Normal is good. Bring it on. CN looks forward to helping Canada's grain farmers succeed in 2022. I just want to follow up on your point about AOC and consensus. Because, what I'm seeing up here in Canada, and I think I saw it earlier in the United States, is a diminishing of the traditional effort on the part of parties to persuade people who don't agree with them to agree with them. And instead of trying to persuade persuadable voters, to motivate people who already agree with you to ensure they go out to vote. So the system is becoming itself inherently polarizing rather than consensus seeking.
Yeah. Well, listen, I think we have, kind of grotesquely misplaced incentives in our political system that interestingly mirror the grotesquely misplaced incentives in social media because resentment, anger, and outrage are more motivating to people than compromise and, a desire to understand the other point of view and so on. And
which we knew 30 years ago when we were running negative ads, right?
Exactly. I mean, I'm not, my hands aren't completely clean in this either, but I'd like to think that the negative ads that I ran were generally, were not over the kind of lines that are crossed routinely every day now. But yeah, but what happens now is look, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is a lunatic, is one of the leading fundraisers in the Republican primary party because her online contributions leap off the page. Trump is a massive fundraiser, and it's a lot of small dollar donations that leap off the page because he knows how to press those buttons. Now in the U.S., David, and I can't speak to Canada. You can speak to Canada. I mean, increasingly, our politics have become tribal. So if you have a D or R next to your name, you're 90%, 95% down the road to getting those votes. There isn't that much of a swing. There is a swing in these marginal districts and states, though. So that's why you see candidates in competitive congressional districts or competitive states taking a much more sober view of these kinds of issues of compromise and using less muted language. But there are fewer. I think there used to be up to half the districts would be somewhat competitive. Now I think they're like probably 35 really truly competitive districts because of the way redistricting is done here. So the only threat to your longevity in politics is winning a party primary, which tends to be dominated by the most strident voices on both sides. And we're seeing that this is what's killing the Republican Party's hope for a landslide in November, which is the way it looked earlier this year. Part of what it is, the abortion issue is a big part of it, but also, they're nominating, and Trump is leading the way, they're nominating candidates who are so far out of the mainstream that in these swing districts and states, they're reducing chances of Republicans winning races that they probably should be able to win in a year like this.
Yeah, Dr. Oz is a good example and a fun example, but I want to look at a different example, and I don't do it to point fun. I'd like you to use it to try to illustrate something to my listeners. So, Herschel Walker in Georgia. Listen, I'm as much of a football fan as anybody was. I enjoyed watching Herschel play. But he has done pretty much everything a person could possibly do to prove his unfitness for the Senate. intellectually and character-wise. Yet he could well win. He's effectively tied. Okay? So what is the mentality of a Georgian who votes for Herschel Walker? What are they thinking about? They must know he's not good. What are they doing?
First of all, he has an R next to his name right now. He is a god in Georgia among football fans. That's number one. He played football there. They remember him for that. He has the Trump the Trump support, and frankly, the whole party fell in behind Trump on this. He was the one who recruited Walker, and McConnell and others decided not to. They think that he has. One of the things that they thought was he could get more African American votes against the African American Senator Warnock than any white candidate, and that's probably going to happen. He's probably going to get 17, 18% of the black vote. That means that Warnock's going to have to get a higher percentage of the white vote than he did, and that most Democrats would in Georgia. This has nothing to do with the attributes of the candidates. This is just tribal stuff. And I think among rural voters, the attacks on Walker's intelligence and so on. This is true among Africans, maybe true among some of the white voters. I think it sounds more like a lot of the elitism that they detest. There's no doubt. I mean, you listen to him speak, and it feels like Herschel Walker is several yards short of a first down here when it comes to his acuity. And yes, there are issues about domestic violence and parenting, but I still think it's going to be a very close race because of the times in which we live, because he has that R next to his name, because he will become a vehicle for these resentments that we've been talking about. And, I'm still, as I sit here, I think the Democrats are more likely than not to keep the Senate, which I wouldn't have said 3 or 4 months ago because of the candidates that they've nominated. But those races are all going to be close. And, if turnout, there was a study the other day that some pollster said if the Democratic turnout is overestimated in the same way that it has been in the past several elections since Trump came on the scene, then Republicans will hold on to the Senate, or we'll get the Senate back. So Walker is in a close race. He could win that race. He could win that race. Yeah.
I know, it's shocking.
And Warnock, by the way, is a very good candidate. I mean, he's a very polished and thoughtful candidate. So it is, it is shocking. But we are so divided, red and blue, in this country. You remember, Biden won the state by a small margin, and it speaks to the nature of that state, and it's very hard to break out of that. This is a big problem. We want a lot of persuadable voters. We want people looking at the qualities of these candidates. We don't want it to be, where we just put on the uniform of our party and march unquestioningly. But for most Americans, that's where we are.
Right. So you mentioned that things look better for the Democrats in the midterms. And that is, really surprising, because I presume that the overwhelming issue in the United States right now is inflation and the cost of living, the cost of gasoline, the cost of food, etc. It's the biggest issue in Canada by a mile. And generally, this is not a time when governments do well, is in these kinds of economic circumstances. Yet the polls are turning in the Dems' favor, and I'm wondering, since I don't believe it has anything to do with the Inflation Reduction Act,
yes.
I don't believe that had any impact on the public whatsoever. I'm assuming it is Dobbs and the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Am I right?
Yes. Well, yes. I think that is largely what's going on here, and you see it in increased registration of women and participation since the Dobbs decision, and they're voting. They ascribe the Dobbs decision to Republicans, and most Republicans, in order to win their primaries, have sworn fealty to the idea of personhood and no exceptions. Many Republicans, no exceptions. I mean, that was
all of which was easy to take as long as Roe was in place.
Right, exactly. I heard Charlie Dent, who's a former congressman, a colleague of mine on CNN, say, when he's a Republican, that he was one of the few pro-choice Republicans in the caucus before he resigned from Congress. And he said he would tell the guys in the caucus, you're fine unless and until Roe gets thrown out. And then you're going to have a real problem. And they are the dogs that caught the car, and now they have to deal with it. That was a huge, huge thing. But it also came amid some other things. 2 mass shootings, I think, that impacted badly on the Republicans. I think this is why McConnell signed on to a gun law compromise, because he recognized that this was, for suburban voters in particular, a galvanizing issue. And then the reemergence of Trump as front and center for, the last thing Republicans want is this election to be about Donald Trump. They want it to be about Joe Biden, and Trump won't go. There's an old song by a group called Dan Hicks and his Hot Licks from 40 years ago, and it was called "How Can I Miss You When You Won't Go Away." I think that's the way a lot of the Republican leaders feel about Trump, but they can't say it because the base, the grassroots, support him, and he has insinuated his way back into the middle. The January 6th hearings have put him back into the middle, and now this incredibly crazy case of him absconding with hundreds of classified documents and super classified documents, and hiding them at his place in Mar-a-Lago. Every single day, the news is leading with that story right now down here. So this is, all of a sudden Donald Trump is back, and all of his issues are back, and the extreme candidates that he's nominated, because the only thing that he asks of candidates is that they deny that the last election was legitimate, and that for him is almost enough. And so you've got a bunch of candidates who are just so far right on so many issues, and that's colored the impression of the Republican Party. So, David, what's happened? You're a student of polls. Huge. By huge, I mean, double-digit movement among independent voters who 6 months ago were saying, geez, Biden's been tugged too far to the left, by the left of his party. Now people are saying, gee, the Republicans have gone way far. They're off the deep end on the right. And so these independent voters are now coming back. And then you have the galvanizing effect among women and young people. So, it was June was a perfect storm, and it's continued into the summer. I do think that we have seen a reduction in gas prices here, and that's helped. It's the most visible manifestation of inflation, but people are still living with inflation. I think a lot of this is being driven by what's going on with Dobbs and sort of Trump. And if the Democrats are managed to hold on to the Senate, or, now it's like a 1 in 3 chance they can hold on to the House, but likely they'll have a lesser margin for the Republicans in the House. Trump and Dobbs will be, the Supreme Court and Trump will be the most valuable players for the Democratic Party in 2022.
And we'll be back in a minute after a message from our sponsor, Google.
What's happening with the rental market?
What summer festivals are on now?
What are the best road trips this summer?
Google helps you find the news that matters most to you. Whether you're looking for news from international publications or your local paper, we help you find a variety of reliable sources. Learn how Google supports news in Canada at g.co/news in Canada.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Trump message is so narcissistic now It's all about whether or not he won in 2020 or not. Like, I mean, in 2015, he was talking about things people cared about, the wall and immigration.
You could be right. He was articulating their grievances, and now he's articulating his own.
Yeah,
and it's all, it's not nearly as effective. I will say this: he's still way ahead among Republican primary voters. He still has, something approaching an 80% approval rating among Republicans. I think this, in the near term, the search of Mar-a-Lago, rallied some of his most ardent supporters and brought some back, who are anti-government and who are apt to believe it's all part of a scheme to stop him. But boy, the accumulated weight of Trump. And I'll tell you something, if this thing continues the way it's going, and the Wall Street Journal poll today, which is conducted by John Anzalone, who polls for Biden, and Tony Fabrizio polls for Trump, now has Democrats in the lead by 3 points. They need to do a little better because of the aggregation of people around cities to just show gains here. But if this thing goes down and Democrats hold on the Senate, the House is close one way or the other, governors, Democrats pick up governors. If it goes down this way, there's going to be a reckoning among Republicans, at least Republican leaders, as to how much of a load can they go into 2024 with, and do they, and what do they do about Trump, because he is not a guy who's going to win in that particular. I think the Wall Street Journal poll now had Biden ahead like 50-44 over Trump. I think they were either tied or Trump was narrowly ahead, but they were basically tied the last time they polled in March. So Trump has really lost ground.
How much of that are the January 6th hearings? I had seen some polling evidence that Republicans were unmoved by the January 6th hearings, but that independents were interested in what they were hearing.
Yeah, well, this is what I was saying before. I think Dobbs is the big mover here, but the January 6th hearings, I think, did play a role, and they're going to resume in September. And then this unpredictable development with the Mar-a-Lago papers is I think, it's associated with the January 6th hearings. And it just raises the question about, about this guy's sundering of laws and rules and institutions, and how much are people willing to take? And I think the answer for independence is increasingly, this is where I get off the train,
Right. So you have been in a job where this question would have come to you. What do you do with Trump now? Do you ignore him, convict him, or pardon him? Like, legally, what do you do with Trump?
This is a really hard question. We've never tried a former president in this country. Richard Nixon was pardoned beforehand. And there's some reason for that. We don't want to be a country. Every time you break a norm, even if the law is clear, every time you break a norm, then it stays unbroken. So now you invite the next administration to try and look for a way to indict and then all of a sudden you're like a third world nation, sort of with the form of democracy, but so that's on the one hand. On the other hand, if you don't hold him accountable, what message does that send to any president? What it basically means is that, yes, the president of the United States is above the law. And so, I guess, I think it's a very hard question, but first of all, I think the president's done the right thing by letting Merrick Garland, the attorney general, handle it. Garland, a former judge, prosecutor, as straight as
should have been a judge.
Should have been a Supreme Court justice, yes. But I think he's a guy of unquestioned integrity, and this
You'd have to be to get on the Supreme Court to be nominated for the Supreme Court, right? You'd have to be a person of enormous personal integrity.
Yes, yeah. Right. That used to be true.
Yeah,
he, when they went into Mar-a-Lago and searched his place, my immediate reaction was, this must be pretty bad, because Garland would not sign off on it if it were not really, really bad. And it turns out it was really bad. I mean, Trump will try and normalize it, but it's like I worked in the government. I know how the lengths to which the responsible people go to protect these secrets, and the fact that he had them in his file cabinet in his office and sitting in his basement near, at Mar-a-Lago near the mustard and the mayonnaise, for his restaurant or whatever, it is just astonishing. And what he was doing with them is a huge question. But I think at the end of the day, either there is the rule of law or there's not. And if you don't, every time Trump was allowed to get away with something, two impeachments and the Mueller investigation, he became more emboldened, and until he's held accountable for what he's done, he's just going to become more emboldened, and there's real danger in that, and there's precedential danger for future presidents. That's, I guess, where I come down.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you 100%. All right, I know we're really tight for your time, and I appreciate it. I want to get some quick handicapping of the next presidential in, and I'm going to shorten this up for you, so make it easy.
I'm glad we got to the end so I can give short answers to this, because...
So my first statement is Biden. Yeah. Biden is too old to run for president in 2024 and too old to be the president in 2028. I sense no enthusiasm about any of the people who ran last time. Who is going to be the Democratic nominee in 2024?
Well, you want a short answer, but I think I've proven throughout this podcast that I'm not capable of that. So let me just say, if Biden runs for president, he will be the Democratic nominee for president. And I think anybody who thinks otherwise is foolish. So it's really up to him whether he'll be the Democratic nominee. I do think there are real issues, and I've raised them, and it's not with any great joy that I do, and it's not very popular among some of my friends. I think you have to confront the reality that if you run, you're asking the American people to make you president to a point where when you leave, you're going to be closer to 90 than 80. And is that a reasonable thing? And will people think it's a reasonable thing?
No, I think that
so I think he needs to consider that. And right now he's riding high. He really has had an accomplished presidency in terms of the legislation that he's passed that have long-term implications for the country, positive implications, led us through the virus, in an honorable way. There are lots of things to his credit, and he could leave. Maureen Dowd wrote a column a few weeks ago saying, "Cash your chips in, brother. This is the time to go." But and it would be, if he did, he would. I think we will find out who can run. The thing about this is, you need campaigns, at least in the American context, you need these campaigns to find out who should be the nominee. Barack Obama was the longest of long shots in 2000. And, I remember this well, in 2007, Hillary Clinton was a prohibitive favorite. But Obama proved himself through that process. Even in this last campaign, Pete Buttigieg was a small town mayor who no one had ever heard of, a gay guy, 37 years old. And he was one of the finalists in the race for president. Now he's in the president's cabinet. He's in the discussion about... You
were pumping his tires 5 years ago when he was running for some position in the Democratic Party at South Bend there.
Yeah. He's a friend of mine. And I think he's an incredibly talented guy. So Democrats need a campaign to find out who should lead the party. But they won't have a campaign if Biden runs, obviously, and they won't have a campaign if he decides late not to run. And so, if he's not going to run, it's best that he say so early rather than late. And, but whether he does or does not, I don't know. And if he does run, and Donald Trump's on the other side, he might win that race. If Donald Trump's not on the other side, it could be more difficult.
Democrats have never not nominated the former vice president if the former vice president wanted it. What makes Kamala Harris the exception to that rule?
Well, she'll certainly run. She'll have support. She is a historic candidate.
She's anything but a front runner right now. It's striking how that it doesn't even come. No one says, well, she could clear the field. People say, well, what's the list of names? Yeah.
And she's going to be it. Now, it's not unusual. A sitting vice president is more unusual. We've had vice presidents or past vice presidents. Look, George H.W. Bush had competition. I'm thinking, yes, he had competition. So it's not unprecedented for vice presidents to have competition. But it is clear that she has not kind of blazed a trail here. She has not put a lot of footprints in the sand. Maybe because they haven't given her a lot to do. Maybe it's because of some element of her. She did run last time. She didn't make it to Iowa. She started off as a co-front runner and didn't make it to Iowa. And so there are issues there as to why that is. But, she'll be in the mix and she'll get votes. And there'll be some who will say, you should clear the field for her. I don't think they will. And, but, she's going to have to do a hell of a lot better this time in terms of explaining why it is that she's running for the office than she did last time.
It's a really good start to have an answer to that question.
That seems important, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Republicans. Is Trump still the likely nominee? And if not, is it DeSantis for sure? Or is there more people in this field too?
I think the answer to the first thing is if Trump runs, depending on how some of this, his legal issues work out, and he can take a lot of water on with this Republican base and still be the nominee. And the interesting thing is, David, that the worse he does in certain ways, the better his situation, because they have largely a winner-take-all primary system over on the Republican side. They're social Darwinists. They think that the winner should get everything. So Trump, he could get 35% of the vote, but if it's
isn't that how Hillary's campaign thought it worked in 2008 too?
Yes, I guess so. But I guess so. But Trump, if there are 10 candidates in the Republican race, Trump could clip along and put a lot of delegates away. And he's shown his primacy in the primary process here in 2022 in a lot of these races. So right now you'd have to say, yes, he's the favorite to be the Republican nominee, and with a big asterisk based on everything that he, all the jeopardy he is subject to right now legally. If he's not the nominee or if he doesn't run, DeSantis is clear. He's the flavor not just of the month, but of the year. He's emerged as someone who is sort of like Trump without the legal baggage. Yeah. And, I think there's another element to DeSantis. We've talked about this replica remedy theory about the incumbent defining the race, whether they're in it or out of it. So what are the things that people don't like about Biden? It really isn't about his character. I think people generally think he is a person of high character. He's pretty accomplished. He's had quite a few of accomplishments. It's that thing we talked about before. They think of him as old, and they don't think of him as particularly strong because of his age. So it makes sense that what people would be looking for is someone who's young and muscular. And so, when you apply that standard, you can sort of see why DeSantis is appealing. He also, he has taken Trump's culture wars to a whole nother level. And he, I describe him as being like the high school football quarterback who slams, the geek against the lockers to get a laugh out of the cheerleaders. I mean, then, he loves to slam liberals against the lockers to get a cheer out of the home crowd. How he will fare during the course of a campaign, which I once described as an MRI for the soul, I don't know. But because I think Trump was entertaining back in 2016. He was kind of fun, Yes, he could be mean-spirited for sure, but there was a show around him. DeSantis is just mean. And or mean-spirited. It strikes me that way. And that he's going to have to, how he, I actually had Kellyanne Conway on my podcast a while ago, which was an interesting experience. But
I bet
she said about DeSantis, and she's clearly still for Trump. She said about DeSantis, it'll be interesting if he loves people as much as he loves his press conferences. And I think that was an incredibly incisive comment. And I think it's the open question you hear from everybody inside the party. How will he wear over time? Who emerges if not him? I don't know. I mean, there are a ton of people who are spoken of. One person who I think it's more likely that he'll be the vice presidential nominee than the presidential nominee. But I'd watch, if you're just betting who would be on the Republican ticket, I'd put some money down on Tim Scott, the senator from South Carolina, African-American, got a good personal story. He's talked about as a presidential candidate. I don't know if he'll get there, and one reason he may not get there is because he's a logical running mate for anybody who would be the nominee. So I just don't know yet. I don't want to go through the whole litany of Republican candidates, but I don't know yet.
As a Canadian, do I care? Trump scared the shit out. I love America, and I wish America had progressive social policies, and I wish it had more equity in its economy. But really, as a Canadian, what I can care about,
and I wish Canada had more baseball.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we can all wish things about each other's societies, but what I really care about is America a robust democracy?
Yes.
And is it playing a constructive role in the world?
Yeah. Yes. And
if I care about those things, do I care who the Republican nominee is? Do they differ on that basis?
There are some who, a lot of them have fallen into the America First column. And isolationism, sort of ethno-nationalism is a pervasive philosophy in the Republican world right now. But there is still a divide in the Republican. There are sort of neocons who are more robust internationalists, and there are these ethno-nationalists like Trump who are isolationists. But it's interesting to me that you say what you say as a Canadian, because all I hear from people around the world is like, what can we do? What can we do to help? What can we help? And it makes you realize how important American democracy is to the world, that the role that we've played. We're not a perfect country by any stretch of the imagination, and we've made mistakes, but we have been for the last 70, 80 years kind of an organizing force behind, a global order that prevented world war, riding to the rescue in times of disaster, and a guarantor of international institutions, and an example with all our imperfections. And it does give you a sense of the weightiness of this, that, if America's not going to be America. And what I hear about Biden in the world is we like him, we trust him, but how do we know what's going to happen after him? And, if he gives us his word, how good is that word? Obama gave us, he signed treaties, and those treaties were and agreements, and they were, mostly agreements, they were abrogated. Paris and the Iran nuclear agreement and so on. So there's a lot at stake, not just for America here, but for the future of democracy. And it was chilling to see Viktor Orban from Hungary come and speak at the CPAC convention, because it speaks to the fact that we're focused on America, but there is a global kind of white Christian ethno-nationalist kind of movement, and you see it in Europe.
Lindbergh.
Yes, yeah, and that's deeply concerning.
Yeah, you should know. I had the German ambassador to Canada on my show, and she said to me flat out, the United States is, for the Western world, the irreplaceable nation. There is no plan B for the Western world if the United States goes south on us.
Well, listen, brother, you're talking to a first-generation American. My father was an immigrant from Eastern Europe. Fled the pogroms there. His home was blown up. He, spent a bunch of his childhood stepping over dead bodies, and he came here and that made everything possible. My family was able to practice their faith. There were opportunities that, and his son grew up to be the senior advisor to the President of the United States. That's the America that I believe in. So I feel really, deeply about this moment that we're in. But I also have this faith that there are people of goodwill across this country, but who want that, but we have to find ourselves in each other, or at least enough of us have to find ourselves in each other again, and our common, humanity and our common interests, even as we have different backgrounds and different specific concerns, in order to succeed. And we need leaders who are going to call that in us. So I guess my belief is in a process that yields those kind of leaders. And that's what I'm keeping my eye out for.
Awesome. David, thank you so much for being so generous.
Happy anniversary! I would have brought a cake, but it's a Zoom. So
it's a Zoom, and that's right. Yes. But maybe we'll watch a baseball game sometime.
We'd like to. I love your shirt, by the way.
Wore it for you.
Yes, I've got my Cubs hat on here too. Mm-hmm. Yes. So we'll come when they just played. Come down here if the Blue Jays make it to Wrigley. We'll go to a game.
You're on. I'll deal with that. Listen, I'm very proud of this show generally, but never more so than right now with you back on it. Thanks so much for doing it. Hey, do you guys actually drink on Hacks on Tap?
I can't. There's certain rules and regulations that prevent me from disclosing that. But we do have Hacks on Tap beer mugs, so that should be a clue.
There you go. Well, hoist one for me next time. I love that show. The X-Files is also terrific. But yeah, Murphy makes me laugh, and a right winger that can make me laugh is always worth something. So I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, our sponsor, CN Rail and Google, everybody who watched and listened today, and of course, the great David Axelrod for joining us. Thanks, brother. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Great to be with you.